Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing an in-depth guide on how to identify the origin of your AK magazines. So all the magazines we're going to be talking about today are all military surplus and military production AK magazines. We're not going to be talking about any of the commercial stuff. We're only going to be talking about how to identify military production and military surplus AK mags. All right, so before we get started, if you're looking for a specific type of AK magazine, make sure you check out the details below. We're going to timestamp out all of the different AK magazines so you can find specifically what you need and you can jump ahead to a section that you are looking for. All right, so in this section, we're going to be talking about 7.62 by 39 millimeter magazines. We're going to break them up by country of origin. So again, if you need to look for something specific, make sure you check out the timestamps below, and let's get started. So the first magazine we're going to start off with is the early slab-side design AK-47 magazines. These early slab-side design Russian magazines are very easy to identify because of that distinct side pattern, where lack thereof of pattern. It's just a standard slab side design. The second thing I'm going to look for on a slab side magazine to identify it as Russian are markings on the spine and on this lower piece of the side plate. You're going to want to look for a surplus of markings. You can see there's a lot of markings on these magazines, and sometimes if you're lucky you'll be able to identify the main origin of manufacture for these magazines. So for example, this one has an Ashevitsk marking, which is that triangle with the arrow inside of it. When you're looking at a slab side design magazine, a lot of them you'll see will have a distinct blued finish if they are an original finish, but a lot of other ones have been reparked and repainted due to how old these magazines are. So to quickly review, if you're identifying a Russian slab side design magazine, again, you're going to want to look for that distinct lack of pattern on the side, markings on the spine, and markings on the base. Russian AK markings usually have shapes with letters or numbers inside them to identify them as Russian. All right, next up on our list of Russian AK magazines is the Bakelite designed magazine. These have this distinct orange color, so they're very easy to identify right off the bat. If you're looking for the origin of manufacture, what you're going to want to look for is the manufacturer's mold marking on the bottom right-hand side here. Russian manufacturer markings will have two. The general two ones you'll find are Ashevitsk and Tula. Ashevitsk being the triangle with the arrow inside, and Tula just being the regular Tula star. Sometimes when you have a Russian magazine, the markings will be ground off, so mainly what you're going to want to look for is the mold numbers on the left-hand bottom side here, that distinct curve showing at 762 by 39. There are some different manufacturers of Bakelite magazines, like there are some out of China, even though they're very rare. Now, the main thing that we want to look for to identify as Russian is very distinct and clear grain in the side of the magazines. The Chinese ones are a little bit more matte compared to the Russian ones. So to quickly review, to identify a Russian Bakelite magazine, the main thing you're going to look for are those mold manufacturer markings on the bottom right here. If those aren't there, you're going to kind of want to look at the grain and compare it to a Chinese magazine. The Chinese magazines are a little bit more red, whereas the Russian ones are a little bit more orange, and the grain is very distinct. All right, so next up we have the Russian rib pattern magazine. These are by far the most common AK magazine on the market. Now, to identify them as Russian, there's going to be a few quick things I'm going to look for. The first thing I'm going to want to look for is the markings on these magazines. There's going to be a lot of markings on the spine and a couple on the base here, but generally they're going to be on the spine on either side here. Russian steel rib design magazines have a lot of markings along the spine, and generally the main marking you're going to find is a lot of shapes with numbers or letters inside them. In addition, Russian AK-47 rib design magazines generally have a manufacturer's mark on the side that either shows that it's from the Ashevitsk factory or the Tula factory. Again, Ashevitsk being that triangle with the arrow inside, and Tula just being the regular Tula star. Now, if you're looking at the markings and they're kind of hard to identify, the next thing you're going to want to look for is the different distinct identification points on the body of the magazines. So for example, Russian magazines have very deep weld marks on this front locking lug. You should be able to run your finger over them and feel the grooves and indentations. In addition to the deep welds on the front locking lug, you'll find deep welds on the top feed lips of the magazine and on these side plates. On the spine of the magazine, there will be just a few different weld marks on here. Sometimes they can be light and sometimes they can be very heavy as well. When you're looking at a Russian AK mag, generally the early ones have a blued finish. Sometimes they'll have a painted finish, but a lot of these magazines have been refinished as they've come into the US market, but if they're an original finish, they'll generally be blued or painted. So in review, if you think you've got a rib design steel AK-47 magazine that's out of Russia, the main things you're going to want to look for are the surplus of markings along the spine and sometimes along the bottom here. Again, they're going to be shapes with numbers or letters inside them. There's going to be those two main identification points from the factory, the Yashevitz triangle or the Tula star. And then you're also going to want to look at the welds along the top and the front feed lip here. They should be heavy, thick welds and pretty easy to identify and to feel when you run your finger across them. All right, so next up is the AK-47 steel rib design magazines out of Poland. The first thing I'm going to want to look for when I'm looking at a Polish steel military surplus AK-47 magazine is the weld marks on this front locking lug. When you're looking at a Polish AK-47 magazine, there's going to be very light weld marks on this front locking lug. When you run your finger across them, you shouldn't feel too much texture, and they'll be very light. Sometimes you've got to adjust them and show the welds in the light in order to even see them. In addition, there will be very light welds along the spine and along these side plates here. Like I said, when you run your finger across them, you shouldn't feel too much texture, and they'll be all the same size, quality, and pattern and spacing. Once I've looked at the weld marks and see that they line up with what should be on a Polish magazine, I'm going to look for markings. On Polish AK magazines, you're going to find a lot of markings along the spine, not as much on what you might find on a Russian magazine, but there will be a few markings along the spine. And also sometimes on the left side of the magazine here, you'll find a marking on this front edge right here. There are two main types of Polish AK-47 magazines. There's early manufacture ones and there's later manufacture ones. Early Polish AK-47 magazines will have a blued finish, whereas the later ones will have a painted finish. If you're looking at an early Polish AK-47 magazine, there's one key marking that's going to tell you that it's Polish right off the bat, and then it's on this front edge right here on the left side of the magazine, and it's going to be an S followed by a number. So for example, this one has an S7. That's going to tell you right off the bat, along with the blued finish, that it's a Polish early magazine. Now the later Polish AK-47 magazines that are painted don't have as many markings, so there's going to be a couple other things I'm going to look for on those. One of the things I'm going to look for is this rear rib that runs along the back of the magazine and meets up with the top feed lip. It's either going to follow it all the way up and underneath this feed lip, or it's going to cut off at a 90-degree angle. On some of the Bulgarian magazines, this back rib right here will cut off at a 45-degree angle, but on Polish magazines, it'll run all the way along to the top. So to review, if I'm looking at a Polish AK-47 magazine, again, I'm going to want to look for light weld marks along this front locking lug here, light weld marks along the side plate and spine. If it's an early magazine, I'm going to want to look for that S number on the front left end right here. And if it's a later one, I'm going to want to look for that painted finish and compare it to an early magazine, which is usually blued. All right, next magazine we're going to identify is AK-47 magazines out of Egypt. Egyptian magazines are this standard rib design that you'll see in most AK magazines. And Egyptian magazines are very difficult to identify, and there's a couple key things you're going to look for, and you're just going to have to use your best judgment. First thing I'm going to look for on Egyptian magazines is deep weld marks along this front locking lug right here. You should be able to run your finger across them and feel a lot of texture, and you'll be able to see them quite easily. The next thing I'm going to want to look for is deep weld marks along the front flap of this magazine. You should be able to run your finger across them and feel them, and they're pretty easy to see and identify. You shouldn't have to tilt them in the light or anything. You should just be able to look at them and see these weld marks along the front. Egyptian magazines also generally always have this deep black painted finish. A lot of times you'll be able to tell it's Egyptian if it has any wear on it at all. The paint will kind of flake away if you get your fingernail underneath it and just kind of fall off, compared to some other finished magazines which you can't really pick off so much. But the Egyptian magazine paint, usually you can just flake right off if it has a little bit of wear on it. In addition, you can tell that it's Egyptian by the finish type is if some of the wear has revealed some of the metal underneath the paint. It'll usually have sort of a brownish tint to it, and that might help you identify it as Egyptian. Generally, Egyptian magazines don't have very many markings on them. I'm looking here, they don't have any markings on this one at all. So if you're looking at a magazine that has almost no markings, along with some of the other points we've talked about, you might be able to identify it as Egyptian. If there are any markings at all, they're going to be on the base plate and they're going to say made in Egypt, which is a pretty obvious indication. So to review an Egyptian AK magazine, again, I'm going to look for those deep weld marks along this front locking lug, deep weld marks along this front end of the flap. I'm going to look for that made in Egypt marking, but if it's not on there and there's no other markings, I'm going to look at that finish type. And if it's a dark matte painted, that can be flaked away. If it's a little bit worn, then that might clue me in that it's an Egyptian AK magazine. All right, next up we have East German AK-47 magazines. East German AK-47 magazines come with that standard rib design, and they're pretty easy to identify. The first thing I'm going to look for is the weld types on these AK mags. If you look at this front locking lug here, you're going to see that there are very light weld marks along this front lug, along these side plates, and in addition, when you look at the spine here, there's going to be a whole lot of weld marks along the spine that are all very consistent in pattern and quality. Sometimes on an East German magazine, you're going to actually need to tilt it into the light a little bit to see those front weld markings along this front locking lug, and the reason for that is because the East Germans did such a good job on welding up these magazines that they're very hard to see. In addition, the welds are going to be very small. The next thing I'm going to look for on an East German AK magazine is any markings along the spine here. On East German magazines, there are full-sized letter markings along the spine that usually reach the entire height of the spine. So for an example, on this one, we have an N and an A. Sometimes there'll be 6 or 7 letters, sometimes there'll only be 2, like on this one. But again, they're full-size capital letters only on the spine of the magazine. Generally, there are no other markings on East German magazines, so the last thing I'm going to look for to identify as East German is the finish type. Almost all East German magazines in their original finish have a blued finish. So in review, to identify a AK magazine as East German, what you're going to want to look for is very light welds along this front lug and a lot of welds along the spine that are very good and consistent quality and size. You're going to want to look for capital letters along the spine here, a nice blued finish, and nice crisp lines on the stamping of the side of the body. Alrighty, next up is probably the most common AK-47 surplus magazine you're going to find, which are Romanian AK magazines. The first thing I'm going to look for on a Romanian AK magazine is deep, thick weld marks along this front locking lug, very similar to the Russian ones. These deep weld marks are going to be very easy to feel with your fingers. In addition, sometimes there will be deep welds along this top feed lip right here and along the side plate as well. You're also going to want to look for weld marks along the spine. They're going to be inconsistent in size and spacing, and sometimes you'll be able to feel them as you run your finger across. The next thing I'm going to look for on Romanian AK-47 magazines is a couple of markings on the spine and also markings on the bottom here where that standard 5-rib design is. On Romanian magazines, you're either going to find small letters or numbers independent of each other. So there's not going to be very many shapes on Romanian magazines, but you might find a G or a 1 or a 2 along this bottom here and sometimes stamped into the side of the spine. In addition, the markings on Romanian magazines are going to be very faded and very small. They're not going to be very crisp stampings. The last marking I might look for on Romanian AK magazines is the Romanian factory symbol, which can sometimes be found along the spine here, and it's that standard Romanian AK factory marking, which is that triangle with the arrow inside with the arrow tail attached to the bottom of the triangle. The finish type on Romanian AK magazines, if it's an original finish, are generally always blued. Sometimes you'll find them refinished with either a parkerization or a painting, but if it's in its original finish, it's generally going to be a blued AK magazine. So to review Romanian AK-47 magazines, I'm going to want to look for deep, thick welds on the front here and along the spine. They should be easy to feel when you run your finger across them. Markings along the spine and the bottom plate right here, unlike other magazines where generally there's no markings right here. And then I'm going to want to look for a blued finish if it's in its original finish. All right, next up on the list are Bulgarian AK-47 magazines. When you're looking at a rib design steel Bulgarian AK-47 magazine, generally the first thing I'm going to look for is this rib on the very back of the magazine here that goes up to these side plates. Unlike other magazines, this side rib right here that goes all the way to the top generally does not meet all the way to the top with the side plates, but comes off at a 45-degree angle, meeting with the end of the magazine, but before it hits the spine. Now, most Bulgarian AK-47 magazines are going to have that 45-degree angle, and sometimes it's almost of a swoop on this rear rib right here. Some of them won't have that, so the next thing I'm going to want to look for is a marking along the spine of the magazine. The Bulgarians did a good job about marking all of their magazines along the spine. Some of them aren't fully seated along the spine, but what I'm going to want to look for is those two circles with either a 10 or an E on the inside. Very similar to what you might see on the side of a Bulgarian rifle. The Circle 10 logo you're going to find on the side of a Bulgarian magazine, the Circle 10 logo or the double circle E logo. Early Bulgarian magazines are going to have a blued finish, whereas later Bulgarian magazines like this one are going to have a deep black painted finish, which look very similar to the Arsenal series of rifles. Last thing you're going to look for on Bulgarian magazines is they are going to have kind of light weld marks along the spine on this front locking lug here. If they're very thick and they're very easy to identify, that might clue you in that it is not a Bulgarian magazine. All right, so to review Bulgarian AK-47 magazines, again, what I'm going to look for is that 45-degree angle swoop along this rear rib right here near the top. I'm going to look for that double circle 10 or E along the spine, and then I'm going to look for either a blued or painted finish with very light weld marks. All right, next up are AK-47 magazines out of Bosnia. Bosnian AK magazines are very easy to identify, commonly known as two-rib magazines. You can identify these because they have two primary ribs running along the side of the magazine, unlike any other AK magazine. The other things you might want to look for on Bosnian magazines are a few of the welds along the spine here. They're very consistent in size and quality, and there's going to be very light weld marks along these side plates on this front locking lug. But again, that main thing you're going to look for is those two ribs along the side and a nice blued finish if it's in its original finish. So again, if you see those two ribs along the side, it's Bosnian, no need to keep going. All right, next up are AK magazines out of China. All right, so when you're looking at an AK magazine, to identify it as Chinese, the very first thing I'm going to look for is the lack of a rear spine along the back here. Sometimes they can be North Korean, but generally, if you're looking at a magazine without a spine on the back, it's probably going to be Chinese. Now, if it does have a spine along the back, but you still think it might be Chinese, the other two things you're going to look for is two ribs on the bottom compared to 5. Now in Yugo AK magazines, the two ribs are just going to be on this main level right here, but on Chinese ones, they're going to run all along the front, down this step, and almost touching to the end of the front of the magazine. The last thing I'm going to look for in a Chinese magazine is some of them also have their unique Chinese AK magazine follower on the front of the magazine. So if you look at the top, it's got a very unique follower compared to the other AK magazines, might be an indication that it is Chinese. So to review, if you're looking at a Chinese AK magazine, you're going to want to look for a lack of a spine. If the spine is there, you're going to want to look for those two ribs running along the entirety of the bottom and that unique follower on the top. All right, next up on our list, we have Hungarian AK-47 magazines. All right, so when you're identifying a Hungarian AK-47 standard rib design magazine, the first thing you're going to want to look for is this base plate removal button. On Hungarian AK-47 magazines, this bottom button is always gray compared to the rest of the magazine, which is generally a matte black. Hungarian AK-47 magazines generally only have markings along the spine, and the markings I'm looking for are zeros and twos. So it could be 02, 20, 22, things like that. And the other marking I might look for is the half moon face marking. And it's a half moon with a face inside of the moon. And that's one very distinct marking that you can identify as Hungarian. If it has that marking, it's definitely Hungarian, though not all Hungarian AK magazines have that marking. The last thing I'll look at is the finish of a Hungarian magazine. Generally, it's always a matte black, but sometimes you'll find a very bright sheen black finish that's been painted on, and it's very reflective, but again, generally it's always going to be this black painted on finish. So in review, if I'm looking for a Hungarian magazine, I'm going to look for that gray button on the bottom, light weld marks along this front lug and along the spine, 02s, 22s, things of that nature along the spine. I'll look for that half moon marker, but that's not always going to be on a Hungarian magazine. And then I'm going to look for that black finish type, either really glossy or very matte like this one right here. All right, next up we have AK magazines out of Finland. All right, so there's a couple key indicators on Finnish AK-47 magazines that are going to clearly identify it as a Finnish AK-47 magazine. The first thing I'm going to look for here is on this rear locking lug on the right hand side here, there's a distinct T T stamping on there. If you see that, that's a very good sign that you're looking at a finished AK magazine. The next thing I'm going to look for is weld marks along these side plates and along this front locking lug here. On finished magazines, they're all very circular and very consistent into the design and spacing. They look very good. You can feel them when you run your finger across them, but they're not very messy. They look very clean and precise. The next thing I look for is on a lot of finished magazines, you're going to find this little sling swivel on the bottom, which they use for pertaining the magazines. And then the last thing I'm going to kind of look at on a finished AK magazine is very crisp lines in the body stamping. Unlike other magazines like Romanian ones where the stampings aren't very crisp, you can see there are very distinct and clear lines along the side of the body here. And generally, if I have a finished magazine, I'm going to look for the finish type, get it? And it's going to be a original blued finish if it has that original finish on it. This one's been repainted and reparkerized, but generally if it's in its original finish type, it's going to have a blued finish. All right, next up we have Yugoslavian AK-47 magazines. All right, so when I'm looking for a Yugo AK magazine, the very first thing I'm going to look for is these two ribs along the bottom here. Now you may remember, unlike Chinese magazines, which these two ribs go all the way to the end of the front of the magazine, Yugoslavian magazines have two short ribs along the bottom here. That's one key indication that's going to immediately identify it as Yugoslavian. The next thing I'm going to look for is the bolt hold open follower. Now, if you compare a standard AK-47 magazine to a Yugoslavian one, you can see that the Yugoslavian one's ridges up a little bit higher than a standard AK magazine. And the reason for that is that actually enables a bolt hold open feature on the Yugoslavian model rifles or on any other AK rifle. The bolt carrier and bolt is going to catch on this back of the feed lip here and keep it open when the magazine is empty. All right, if you're interested in the weld marks on the Yugo magazine, they're very light, but not much to really notice there. And the last thing I'm going to look for on a Yugo magazine is the finish type. Generally, Yugo AK magazines are all blued finish. So to review a Yugo AK magazine, again, I'm going to look for those two short ribs on the bottom, the bolt hold open follower, and the blued finish. All right, next up we have Serbian Model 320 AK-47 magazines. These Serbian Model 320 magazines are really easy to identify. They are made from a polyamide material, which is similar to the German H&K type plastics. They have a very distinct waffle pattern on the side, very wide base plate, and a bolt hold open follower. And again, these are newer manufacturer military magazines, Serbian Model 320. All right, next up we actually have a 75 round drum magazine, and what you're going to want to look for to identify this is the markings. There's two types of 75 round top loading drum magazines. There are the Russian manufacturer ones, and then there are the Romanian manufacturer ones. Generally on the Russian manufacturer ones, you're going to want to look for the Malat shield with a star inside. Those are generally always on the Russian manufacturer ones, and that identifies it as Russian. On Romanian ones, like the one you see here, you're just going to want to look for a standard number and letter combination marking on the front here. Very easy to identify, and there aren't any factory markings on Romanian magazines. All right, now let's quickly go over some other key magazines that are a little bit more rare, and I'm going to talk about what you might want to look for on those. So first up, if you're looking at a North Korean magazine, what you're going to want to look for is a body design that is very similar to a Chinese magazine, but the main thing you're going to look for is the North Korean marking, which is a circle with a star inside. Another unique magazine you might come across is the Fleur-de-Lis magazine. They're going to be very similar in design to the Bosnia magazine, but it's going to have that unique identifying Fleur-de-Lis stamping on the side there. Now for 40 round magazines, you're going to want to use the same methods to identify 30 round magazines as the 40 round ones. So for example, the Romanian ones will have the standard Romanian body design, deep weld marks, and the markings along the spine. Chinese ones will have either a spine or no spine along the bottom, and you're going to want to look for those two ribs on the bottom, and the Russian magazines can be identified the same as Russian 30 round magazines. Hey guys, thanks so much for joining us on this magazine guide video. Make sure you hit like and subscribe, it really helps us out, and let us know down in the comments if you found this information helpful or if you have any information to add as well. We'd love to see what other information you have so we can help people identify what kind of AK mags they have. Also, let us know down in the comments if you watched this thing all the way through, because that was a lot of information. Again, thanks for watching.